Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode we journey back to the origins of the Transformers franchise and the story of Bumblebee.
After Cybertron falls to the Decepticons, the remaining Autobots flee with B-127 sent to Earth circa 1987. Shortly after arrival he is attacked and severely damaged, losing his voice and memory, and transforms into a Volkswagen Beetle. Charlie Watson, played by Haley Steinfeld, finds the Beetle and takes it home for her 18th birthday, discovering B-127, who she renames Bumblebee and takes care of. Bumblebee is pursued by Decepticon triple changers Shatter and Dropkick, voiced by Angela Bassett and Justin Theroux, who have teamed with Sector 7, led by John Cena's Jack Burns, and want to learn the location of Optimus Prime, voiced by Peter Cullen.
80s nostalgia has dominated pop culture for much of the last decade, and one of the earliest signs of its resurrection was the revival of the Transformers franchise, arguably that decade's most popular toy, with director Michael Bay and executive producer Steven Spielberg colliding forces to make the original 2007 live-action film. Despite it being a 2-hour-plus Hasbro commercial, it wasn't really aimed at children, so much as it was aimed at the adults that played with the toys as kids. So from a blockbuster marketing point of view, it was very much broadly aimed at all demographics, so it's no surprise that it was enormously successful, managing to kick off a very lucrative franchise, despite the fact it was much maligned by critics. In fact, even more so as this franchise progressed along, but audiences kept going back time and time again. I think a large part of that is because they had such affinity for the toy. Every time that they went into these movies, they wanted to essentially recreate the sense of plastic being bashed together, and that's exactly what Bay gave them. He gave them a lot of really intense, over-the-top action scenes that were barely strung together by a really incomprehensible plot, very questionable humour that bordered on racism and sexism frequently, and often had objectionable content that really wasn't suited for something that was based off of a toy line. But I think even as the series went on longer and longer, audiences were starting to tire of it, and that was very much evident by the time The Last Knight rolled around, which tried to configure the series into a massive shared universe, and they simply weren't having that anymore. That was by far the lowest grossing of the Transformers franchise, and the message was clearly sent. Transformers needs a reboot. It needs to go back to basics. That's where this spin-off comes in. Bumblebee is the first live-action Transformers movie that isn't directed by Michael Bay, although he does have a producer credit on it. It's actually directed by Travis Knight of the animation studio house Laika, who previously directed Kubo and the Two Strings. He's making his live-action debut here, and I do think that this is a movie that very much tries to tap into what people liked about the Transformers in the first place, especially because it even goes back to the 80s in that respect. And the fact that it doesn't have Bay in the driver's seat makes it already feel like such a different movie, especially because the movie is a lot more character focused and very much focuses itself on the origin of the titular character. In some ways, Bumblebee could be considered a sort of remake of the 2007 film, not least of which because it goes back to the original conceit that could be traced all the way to executive producer Steven Spielberg of, what if instead of a boy and his dog, what if it was a boy and his robot, or in this film's case, a girl and her robot. It's a coming-of-age story of adolescence maturing into adulthood that's tied with this very American concept of you get your first car, that's when you become an adult. That's something that's explicitly stated in both the Bay film, but also in Bumblebee, perhaps even more so, which ties Charlie's 18th birthday with the title character. That's when she receives him as a birthday present, and the film very much constantly reminds you of it because she's always saying she's 18, she's not a kid anymore, she's an adult. The difference between the two movies, though, does start to become apparent over time, especially when you consider that in hindsight, I don't think Bay was ever wholly interested in that particular idea. It drives the earliest scenes in that film, but once the other Autobots arrive, you'll note that it starts to lose that particular thread, whereas in Bumblebee, it's very much the core of this movie that Charlie and Bumblebee both grow together, and the film follows that right to the very end. And in doing so, it chases that kind of 80s Spielbergian whimsy that even that director himself has tried to replicate earlier this year with Ready Player One, but also the imagery of coming-of-age stories from John Hughes. The Breakfast Club plays a very prominent role in this film, in case you missed that particular idea. When we're introduced to Charlie, it seems like she's in the midst of a particularly painful adolescence. There's a loss in her life that she's unhappy about, not least of which a go-nowhere amusement park job that she despises, but in general she cuts a fairly lonely, isolated figure even within her own family. She's got this rebellious attitude that a lot of teenagers have that's represented by a choice of t-shirts of rock and metal bands that she cycles through over the course of the film. Like so many people of that age, it seems like she can't wait to grow up, she can't wait to break free. She feels both simultaneously stifled and ignored. And as the film progresses, we understand where a lot of that mindset comes from, and a lot of it is grief over her father. She was very close to him. He was the one that taught her how to be a mechanic. They were building a car together. He was the one that supported her doing competitive diving. And then, very suddenly, he died. And she's got all these unresolved feelings that she simply does not know what to do with. It's a gaping wound within her that hasn't healed. And yet, the rest of the world turns around her. And that is what makes her so angry, is because even though she hasn't moved on, everyone else has. Even her mother has moved on, and what her relationship with Bumblebee allows her to do is to open up to someone for the very first time. She's put up this guarded shield against herself, and normally a character like this could end up being too cynical for the audience to really connect with, but in general I think Steinfeld plays the character just right. Yes, she's going through the tribulations of being a teenager and all the emotions that come with that, but she's also very likeable, and I do think that the character does show a lot of emotion and warmth. She does show a lot of vulnerability that allows us to connect with her, and I think that Steinfeld's performance is even more impressive when you consider the fact that she's actually acting against nothing a lot of the time. She's having these really emotional scenes against thin air. That robot isn't coming in until later in post-production, and yet she manages to make that relationship feel very natural on screen. It does genuinely feel like she's interacting with her robot co-star. And if this feels so different to anything else in the live-action Transformers franchise, there's an easy reason for that. It's written by a woman. It's written by Christina Hodson, although it's also worth noting there are uncredited rewrites by Kelly Fremont Craig, who wrote and directed The Edge of 17, which previously starred Haley Steinfeld. So if there are elements of Steinfeld's characterization that seem a little bit familiar, there's an explanation for that as well. But I think that combination of talents of Steinfeld, Craig, and Hodson, what they have created together is a very sympathetic and recognisable character and a much needed perspective shift, especially given that the Bay films are notorious for their male gaziness, of how the camera objectifies and leers over women in their framing, and how Bay often casts models in the key roles. Instead, what Bumblebee takes is a much more personal, much more intimate story, which proves to be a major boon and makes us reassess what a Transformers movie can be. I think that a lot of critics just simply dismiss it as robots fighting each other. This proves you can do much more with that concept. And I do think that the second act of the film is perhaps maybe bordering on a little bit too uneventful, but in general, the smaller scale of the film works, and it feels particularly refreshing just because of how much Bay filled his movies top to bottom as a sensory overload. Instead, Bumblebee is a surprisingly pleasant ride. That's not to say the film isn't free of Bayisms. He is still a producer after all, and there are certain moments that remind you are watching a Transformers film. Charlie's family, for example, is painted fairly broadly and at times does border on sitcom-y, but nowhere near as badly as the dreaded Witwicky family in the first 3 Transformers films, which were screeching comic relief that had no relation to reality. Here, they're very much loving, devoted parents, but they're also totally clueless. They buy their daughter, for an 18th birthday present, a flowery bicycle helmet that even a kid would be ashamed to wear, and her younger brother, who's obsessed with martial arts, is fairly obnoxious. But you can understand why they've caricatured the characters this way. It's because a lot of teenagers feel like that about their parents and their siblings when they're growing up. But the thing that very much feels like a Transformers movie is the emphasis on the military, or in this case, Sector 7. What this movie also functions as is a sort of origin story for that. You remember the robot hunting force in the Michael Bay films that were led by Simmons, who was played by John Turturro in that film, and actually has a cameo in this one. What an early scene when someone rushes in to see John Cena very excitedly to report something. You'll note that his name badge says Simmons. That's right. It's the younger version of Turturro's character, well before he got lubricated by Bumblebee many years later. But this aspect of the film is again much more subdued than the Bay films, where they would often use that particular angle and storyline as a way of injecting a lot of military action into the proceedings. There is a bit of that here, but not as much as Michael Bay likes to indulge in. I did quite like John Cena in this movie, but he's not really given a whole lot to do other than be a clean-cut military guy. His character is actually the first one that Bumblebee meets on Earth, and it doesn't really go very well, because obviously when a giant robot interrupts your training exercise, yeah, you're gonna chase after it and shoot it. But he's not the villain of the movie. Not really. He's a good, honest man trying to do his job to the best of his abilities. He's simply got the wrong end of the stick. He's misinformed and he does not know what he's in the middle of. And even as Sector 7 starts working with the Decepticons, who are presenting their cause as simply trying to find an escaped fugitive, Cena does have some amusing moments where he points out their situation, especially the one where he points out, they're called Decepticons! Why are we trusting them? So Cena knows how to sell a comic line like that. I think that's where his acting strengths lie. But otherwise, he's pretty much just there to be tough and intimidating. And like a lot of the more Bayish elements, they are sort of still there in Bumblebee, but they're very much dialed back. This military aspect of it is pushed into the background. But I think where audiences are most likely to appreciate the difference is in how the film treats the robots, and a lot of that comes down to Travis Knight's animation background. He knows how to frame and scale a shot. The previous Bay films were largely framed at 2:35:1, which is very narrow. It's wider than it is tall, which is particularly troubling when you've got large robots in it. A lot of people complain that the fight scenes are really hard to follow. That's because it's so kind of crammed into that particular frame. It feels really claustrophobic. Bumblebee opens itself up to the much taller 185. You can comfortably have a whole height of the robot in the frame, but you can also pull in much closer. You can get close-ups of a robot's face next to a character of a human scale, and it doesn't feel really tight. And that really works for the kind of story that this is telling. And before you say anything, yes, I know the Bay films had IMAX versions that opened themselves up in certain scenes, or that Last Night had a shifting aspect ratio that changed every single shot. That's really irrelevant. This is the first that consistently opens up like this, and it works so well. It's a simple change, but it's a fairly dramatic one. And in general, because the film has much less robots in it, it gives them much more room to shine in terms of personality, especially Bumblebee. This is the best that he's ever been characterised in any of these movies. The scene where he first transforms in the garage, I actually found myself being surprisingly affected by that in a way that I hadn't anticipated, because he does so and then he cowers in the corner, really scared and vulnerable, even though she couldn't possibly hurt him even if she tried. And I think that is informed by the scenes preceding that, where we see Bumblebee essentially robbed of his identities, robbed of his memories, robbed of his voice. And watching this scene happen after that, it's surprisingly emotional for me. It really kind of struck this chord with me, and that's something that I've never felt in any of these movies, and I think it speaks to the way the film is characterised. Bumblebee in this film is equal parts pet, friend, and surrogate father figure Projector, and I really like the way that he's animated in this film. He's largely a silent character. He has to learn over the course of the film to do the radio tuning speak that has become his signature style, but a lot of his humour in this film is simply through body language, the scale of the character in terms of his environment. There's a lot of physical comedy, and even his eyes. There's a lot to be said about those big blue eyes that are kind of puppy dog-esque a lot of the time, and then they revert to red when he's in battle mode. It really feels like there's a lot of consideration placed into the design of the characters that I didn't feel in the previous Bay films. And the film even does triple change Decepticons, and it doesn't feel like it's cluttered. The film runs through their cycles of transformation, and it's very clear. Everything all of a sudden feels much cleaner in a lot of regards. The fight scenes feel really comprehensible. They feel like they have a genuine sense of scope about them. You know exactly what is happening at all times. It's so well photographed. This film actually does that portion of the film much better than the bombastic Bay films ever did. And this is a much quieter movie. The action scenes bookend the film, and that may disappoint some audiences. And I think that the opening scenes are very much things that fans have wanted to see. I really like the fact that they leaned into the 80s aesthetic when it came to the designs of the characters. They very much went back to generation 1 of the original toys, and I think that that's what they really should have done all along, because again, a long-standing issue with these Transformers films is just how cluttered the designs of the robots are. They become this whir of mixed parts, and you don't know who's fighting who. This is especially the problem with the Decepticons, who previously were all grey, so you couldn't tell any of them apart, really, and they've just simplified it. I do think the movie leans a little bit too heavily on the 80s aesthetic, though. You've got characters eating Mr. T cereal, Tab Cola, Alf pops up on the TV screen, there's a lot of vintage soundtrack samples, The Touch even pops up at one point, which is really on the nose as far as meta references go, top-loading VHS players, Bumblebee does the famous Judd Nelson pose from The Breakfast Club. Cumulatively, it all gets a little bit much. I mean, I know, movie, what you're trying to do. You're playing towards people who grew up in this particular time frame, who had the toys when they first came out. I completely understand you leaning towards that, but it feels less like an aesthetic, less like a representation of how things actually were, and very much leaning more into kind of pastiche territory, and at that point, that's when it starts to get a little bit obnoxious. There were definitely moments in this film where I was a little bit distracted by it, going, do you remember this? Do you remember this? Do you remember this? Just a little bit too much at certain moments. Bumblebee is easily the best Transformers movie to date, bar none. It's not a perfect film. While I appreciate the low-key approach, I think there's definitely a happy medium between something like this and something like a Michael Bay film. I do think you could have added a little bit more action, particularly in that slower second act, and it wouldn't have necessarily hurt it, but I do think this is an immense improvement on everything that has gone before it. And I think they'll work not just for people that grew up with the Transformers, but also kids that are experiencing it for the very first time. At last, a Transformers movie actually feels like it was made with kids in mind. This feels genuinely made for that particular audience, and I think they will capture their imagination. I think they will genuinely respond very positively to this, and I think it shows that in general this franchise has been rather mismanaged when you think about it, in spite of its enormous success, and I would really love to see it continue down this particular route. It feels like at last this is the Transformers movie that we really should have got in the first place.
Bumblebee is easily the strongest of the Transformers films to date and feels truer to the spirit of the franchise. Returning to the coming-of-age premise, Bumblebee tells it better than the original Bay film, attaining a surprising amount of warmth and emotion from the friendship between Charlie and her robot, with Haley Steinfeld giving a punky and rebellious performance as she deals with her grief. The film mostly ignores large-scale action, using it to bookend a smaller story that is far more character-driven, but the fight scenes when they do arrive are better executed with clear framing and choreography, aided by the cleaner retro designs of the robots themselves. Although perhaps director Travis Knight leans a touch too heavily on 80s nostalgia, his love for Transformers clearly shines through, and gives the movie a heart so desperately lacking from the cluttered, cynical Bay blockbusters.
If you like this review, then you can roll out to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.